When a billionaire's life hangs by a thread, and a single father makes a choice that will shatter both their worlds. Some rescues cost more than money can ever repay. In the span of 30 seconds, Victoria Hale went from untouchable CEO to broken woman trapped in twisted metal until a stranger's hands pulled her from death itself, then disappeared without a word. This is the story of two lives that should never have collided, a rescue that became an obsession, and the moment when power met principle in the most unlikely place. Stay with me until the end of this journey and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight, turning downtown Seattle's construction zone into a slick maze of orange cones and churning mud. Victoria Hale sat in the back of her Mercedes S-Class fingers, dancing across her tablet screen as quarterly reports flowed past her eyes like a digital river. The Hale Industries logo gleamed from the corner of each document, a steel tower reaching toward an infinite sky, much like the woman who'd built the empire it represented. "Ma'am, we're going to hit some delays up ahead." Her driver Marcus called back, his weathered hands steady on the wheel, despite the chaos outside. "Construction crews are working overtime to beat the storm." Victoria didn't look up. "Take 5th Street. I have a board meeting in 20 minutes, and Senator Morrison doesn't wait for anyone." Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who'd learned early that hesitation was luxury she couldn't afford. At 34, she commanded a construction empire worth $2.8 billion, had rebuilt half of Seattle's skyline, and could make grown men in $1,000 suits stammer with a single glance. But she couldn't control the weather. The Mercedes crawled through the industrial district, past towering cranes that swayed like metal giants in the wind. Victoria's phone buzzed another text from her assistant about the Morrison deal. The senator wanted to discuss the waterfront development project, the one that would cement her legacy as the woman who transformed Seattle's skyline. Everything was falling into place just as she'd planned. She didn't see the crane operator above fighting against controls that had been screaming warnings for the past 10 minutes. Didn't hear him shouting into his radio about hydraulic failure, about steel beams swinging wild in the storm wind. Didn't know that at that exact moment, a 2-ton I-beam was breaking free from its cables 40 feet above her moving car. 2 blocks away, Blake Carter was wrapping up the longest day of his week. His hard hat dripped steadily as he secured the last of his tools, every muscle in his back, reminding him of the 12 hours he'd spent pouring concrete foundations. The overtime pay would help Emma needed new shoes, and the electric bill wasn't going to pay itself, but God, he was tired. At 28, Blake carried the weight of responsibilities that should have belonged to 2 parents. 3 years since Sarah had died in that car accident. 3 years of figuring out how to be both father and mother to a 5-year-old girl who still asked when mommy was coming home. His hands, scarred from years of construction work, were gentle enough to braid Emma's hair each morning before school. His shoulders, broad enough to carry steel beams, somehow always found room for one more bedtime story. He'd been heading to his pickup truck when he heard it, a sound like the sky tearing open, followed by screaming metal and the horrible crunch of impact. Blake's head snapped toward the street, just as a steel beam crashed down onto a black Mercedes, crushing the roof like an accordion and sending glass exploding across the wet asphalt. For a moment, the world went silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. Then Blake was running. His work boots pounded against the slick pavement as he sprinted toward the wreckage, his mind automatically cataloging the damage. The beam had struck the passenger compartment at an angle, crumpling the roof, but leaving a small pocket of space near the rear door. If anyone was alive in there, they had minutes, maybe less, before the whole structure collapsed completely. Other construction workers were shouting behind him, calling for ambulances, for supervisors, for someone else to handle this. But Blake had learned a long time ago that sometimes you couldn't wait for someone else. His father had taught him that before the cancer took him when Blake was 16. "Son," the old man had wheezed from his hospital bed, "we don't help people because we get something out of it. We help because it's the right thing to do and because someone has to." The Mercedes was worse up close. Steam rose from the crumpled hood, mixing with the rain to create an eerie fog around the wreckage. Blake could smell gasoline, which meant they were running out of time fast. He dropped to his knees beside the rear passenger door, peering through the spider-webbed window. That's when he saw her. Victoria Hale was conscious but trapped, her perfectly styled blonde hair now dark with blood, her tailored suit torn and dirty. She was wedged between the crushed roof and the seat, one arm clearly broken, but her eyes, those startling green eyes that had stared down senators and CEOs, were alert and focused on his face. "Can you hear me?" Blake called through the broken window, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'm going to get you out of here." Victoria tried to speak, but only managed a weak nod. Blood trickled down her forehead, and Blake could see she was going into shock. The steel beam above them groaned ominously, settling another inch closer to crushing what remained of the car's interior. "Okay, listen to me," Blake said, his hands already working at the twisted doorframe. "My name is Blake. I need you to stay awake, stay with me. Can you move your legs?" Another nod. That was good. No spinal damage, maybe. Blake's calloused fingers found purchase on the doorframe and pulled. The metal groaned, but didn't budge. He tried again, putting his full strength behind it, muscles straining against the twisted steel. Nothing. Behind him he could hear sirens approaching, but they were still blocks away. The smell of gasoline was getting stronger, and the beam was settling lower. In another few minutes, it wouldn't matter how many paramedics arrived. "I'm going to try something else," Blake told Victoria, shrugging out of his reflective safety vest. "Don't move, don't try to help. Just stay awake for me." He wrapped the vest around his hands and grabbed a piece of broken concrete from the construction site. 3 quick, precise strikes against the door's hinges, and he felt them give way. The door was still pinned by the roof, but now he had room to work. Blake braced his feet against the car's frame and grabbed the door with both hands. This time, when he pulled, something deep in his core seemed to unlock not just physical strength, but something else. The desperate knowledge that someone's daughter, someone's everything, was trapped in twisted metal and counting on him not to fail. The door came free with a shriek of protesting steel. Victoria looked up at him through pain-glazed eyes as he crawled halfway into the wreckage, his broad shoulders filling the small space he'd created. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that probably intimidated most people. But right now, she just looked scared and human and breakable. "I've got you," he said quietly, sliding one arm behind her shoulders and another under her knees. "This is going to hurt, but I need you to hold on to me." Victoria's good arm wrapped around his neck as Blake carefully lifted her from the wreckage. She was lighter than he'd expected, all sharp angles and delicate bones beneath her expensive clothes. He could feel her trembling as he carried her away from the Mercedes, could hear her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps against his neck. They'd made it maybe 20 feet when the steel beam finally gave up its fight with gravity. It crashed down with a sound like thunder, crushing what remained of the car into a flat pancake of metal and glass. Sparks flew as steel met asphalt, and the smell of gasoline was replaced by the acrid stench of twisted metal and burned rubber. Blake didn't stop moving until they were well clear of the wreckage, finally lowering Victoria onto a dry patch of concrete near the sidewalk. Only then did he allow himself to look back at what they'd escaped. The Mercedes was completely flattened, a tomb of steel and shattered dreams that would have been her final resting place if he'd been 30 seconds slower. "Jesus," someone breathed behind him. Blake turned to see his foreman, Mike Rodriguez, staring at the wreckage with mocked eyes. "Blake, how the hell did you call it in to the company?" Blake interrupted, his voice rougher than usual. "Make sure they know nobody from our crew was at fault. That beam failure was mechanical, not human error." Mike nodded and reached for his radio, but his eyes never left Blake's face. In 10 years of working construction together, he'd never seen Blake do anything quite like this. Sure, the man was strong, stronger than most, but what they'd just witnessed was something else entirely. The ambulance arrived as Blake was shrugging back into his safety vest, the paramedics taking over Victoria's care with professional efficiency. She was conscious, responsive, asking about her phone and her driver, and whether the Morrison meeting could be rescheduled. Even in shock, even covered in blood and concrete dust, she was still trying to run her empire. "Sir," one of the paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes, approached Blake as her partner worked on Victoria. "The patient keeps asking for you. She wants to know your name." Blake glanced over at Victoria, who was now strapped to a backboard, but still alert enough to be arguing with the medical team about hospital protocols. Their eyes met across the chaos of flashing lights and radio chatter, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just that connection. "Blake Carter," he said simply. The paramedic nodded and started to head back, but Blake caught her arm. "Wait, don't tell her that. Just tell her she's going to be fine." But she specifically asked, "Please." Blake's voice carried a weight that made the paramedic pause. "Just tell her that." He watched as they loaded Victoria into the ambulance, her green eyes searching the crowd, until they found his face one last time. She tried to say something, her lips moving behind the oxygen mask, but the words were lost in the wail of sirens as the ambulance pulled away. Blake stood in the rain for a long time after the emergency vehicles had gone, staring at the flattened Mercedes and thinking about split-second decisions and the way the world could change in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Around him, his crew was cleaning up debris and answering questions from police officers, but he felt strangely disconnected from all of it. "You okay, man?" Mike appeared at his elbow, offering a cup of coffee from the thermos he always kept in his truck. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Blake accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his cold fingers around the warm cup. "Just thinking about timing, I guess. What if I'd left 5 minutes earlier? What if I'd been looking the other way?" "But you weren't," Mike said firmly. "You were exactly where you needed to be when you needed to be there. That's not coincidence, hermano. That's something else." Blake didn't answer. He was thinking about his father's words, about doing the right thing simply because it was right. But he was also thinking about the woman in the ambulance, about the way her broken voice had whispered, "Thank you," as he'd lifted her from the wreckage. Victoria Hale. He'd recognized the name from the newspapers, from the signs on half the construction sites in the city. She was everything he wasn't: wealthy, powerful, connected to a world he'd never understand. And somehow, for 30 seconds, none of that had mattered. By the time Blake finally climbed into his pickup truck, the rain had stopped, and the construction site had returned to its normal, controlled chaos. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking at his hands on the steering wheel. They were the same hands that had braided Emma's hair that morning, the same hands that signed homework sheets and made peanut butter sandwiches and built playhouses out of scrap lumber on Saturday afternoons. But today they had saved a life. Blake started the engine and pulled out into traffic, already thinking about the evening ahead. Emma would be waiting at the babysitter's house, probably full of stories about her day at kindergarten and excited to show him the picture she'd drawn of their family, always just the two of them, now standing in front of their small apartment building with impossibly large smiles. He wouldn't tell her about today. There was no point. Emma was 5 years old, and her world was still small enough to make sense. She believed that daddies were heroes by default, that good things happened to good people, and that the world was fundamentally fair. Blake intended to let her believe that for as long as possible. As he drove through the city streets, Blake caught glimpses of the Hale Industries logo on buildings and billboards, reminders of the woman whose life he'd just saved. By tomorrow, she'd be back in her world of board meetings and corporate decisions, and he'd be back to pouring foundations and framing walls. Their paths had crossed for less than an hour, but somehow he knew that moment would stay with him. What Blake didn't know was that across the city in a private room at Seattle General Hospital, Victoria Hale was lying awake despite the pain medication, her mind racing, not with thoughts of deals or meetings or quarterly reports, but with the memory of a stranger's voice saying, "I've got you," in the darkness of twisted steel. She'd asked every nurse, every doctor, every police officer for his name. Blake Carter, the paramedic, had finally told her. But when she'd asked for his contact information, for some way to thank him properly, she'd hit a wall of professional courtesy and privacy policies. The hospital couldn't give out personal information. The construction company would only confirm that he was an employee, not provide his address. Even the police report listed him simply as witness, Good Samaritan. Victoria Hale, who had built an empire by finding solutions to impossible problems, couldn't find the man who had saved her life. But she would. Because if there was one thing Victoria understood, it was that every debt had to be paid, especially the ones that mattered most. Blake Carter had given her something more valuable than money could measure, and she intended to return the favor. She just had no idea that when she finally found him, everything she thought she knew about strength, about power, and about what it meant to truly help someone would be turned completely upside down. The rain started falling again as Blake pulled into the parking lot of Mrs. Chen's house, where Emma waited with her backpack and her bright smile and her absolute faith that her daddy would always come home safe. He sat in the truck for one more moment, letting the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. Tomorrow he would return to the construction site. Tomorrow he would pour concrete and frame walls and do the work that kept food on their table and a roof over their heads. Tomorrow he would wake up early to braid Emma's hair and make her breakfast and send her off to school with a kiss and a promise to pick her up at 3:30. But tonight he would hold his daughter a little tighter, read an extra bedtime story, and be grateful for split-second timing and the simple fact that sometimes when it mattered most, ordinary people could do extraordinary things. Across the city, Victoria Hale was making very different plans. The news broke at 6 a.m. sharp, exactly 12 hours after the accident. Victoria's assistant, Patricia, had worked through the night to control the narrative, but there was no containing a story like this. Billionaire CEO nearly killed in construction accident, screamed from every news website, accompanied by grainy cell phone footage of the twisted Mercedes and aerial shots of the rescue scene. Blake learned about it the way most people did, from the television in Mrs. Chen's kitchen, where Emma was eating her cereal and chattering about the field trip to the aquarium her class would take next week. The morning news anchor's voice cut through Emma's excited planning like a blade. This exclusive footage shows the dramatic rescue of Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Industries, who was pulled from her vehicle just seconds before a 2-ton steel beam completely crushed the car. The identity of the construction worker who performed the rescue has not been released, but witnesses describe his actions as nothing short of heroic. Blake's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. There on the screen was footage he'd never seen shot from across the street by someone with a phone camera. The angle was wrong, the image shaky, but he could see himself running toward the Mercedes, could watch his own desperate fight with the twisted doorframe. "Daddy, that looks like your work clothes." Emma pointed at the screen with her spoon milk dripping back into her bowl. "See the yellow hat? You have a yellow hat." Mrs. Chen, who had been watching Blake's face carefully, reached over and changed the channel to cartoons. "Eat your breakfast, little one. Your daddy needs to get to work soon." Blake drained his coffee in one swallow, his mind racing. The news report had been deliberately vague about his identity. But how long would that last? Oh. How long before some enterprising reporter figured out which construction company had been working that site before they started asking questions and taking pictures? "I have to go," he said, kissing Emma's forehead and grabbing his lunch cooler. "Be good for Mrs. Chen, okay? I'll see you after school." Emma nodded solemnly, already absorbed in her cartoons, but Mrs. Chen followed Blake to the door. She was a small woman in her 70s, a widow who had been watching Emma since Blake had to return to work after Sarah's death. Her English was still accented after 40 years in America, but her understanding of people was perfect in any language. "Blake," she said quietly, "famous people, they don't forget debts like this. You helped her, she will want to help you back. This is how their world works." Blake paused with his hand on the doorknob. "I don't want anything from her, Mrs. Chen. I just want to keep my head down and take care of Emma." The old woman studied his face with knowing eyes. "Sometimes what we want and what we get are different things. You are a good man, but you cannot control everything. Be careful." The construction site was chaos when Blake arrived. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray Seattle sky like metallic flowers. Reporters clustered around the entrance, shoving microphones at anyone wearing a hard hat and asking the same questions over and over. "Did you see the rescue? Do you know the hero's identity? What was it like to witness such an incredible act of courage?" Blake parked 2 blocks away and entered through the back gate, hoping to avoid the media circus. But Mike Rodriguez was waiting for him along with the site supervisor and 2 men in expensive suits who definitely weren't construction workers. "Blake," Mike said, his expression unreadable. "These gentlemen want to talk to you." The taller of the 2 suits stepped forward, extending a manicured hand. "Mr. Carter, I'm David Harrison, legal counsel for Hale Industries. This is James Morrison, head of corporate security. We'd like a word if you don't mind." Blake minded plenty, but he found himself shaking Harrison's hand anyway. The lawyer's grip was firm, professional, the handshake of a man accustomed to getting his way through persistence rather than force. "We understand you were the individual who assisted Ms. Hale yesterday," Morrison said. He was shorter than Harrison, built like a former cop with eyes that cataloged everything they saw. "We'd like to thank you personally and discuss how Hale Industries can show its appreciation." "That's not necessary," Blake replied, already knowing where this conversation was heading. Anyone would have done the same thing. Harrison and Morrison exchanged a look that Blake didn't like. It was the look of men who had expected this response and had prepared for it accordingly. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private," Harrison suggested, gesturing toward the site trailer. Away from the media attention. Blake glanced at Mike, who shrugged apologetically. The message was clear, this wasn't really a request. Blake followed the 2 men into the trailer, wondering how his quiet life had suddenly become so complicated. The trailer was cramped, with the 3 of them inside, dominated by a folding table covered with blueprints and safety reports. Harrison took the only chair while Morrison remained standing by the door, a positioning that Blake recognized as both casual and strategic. "Ms. Hale is recovering well." Harrison began opening a leather portfolio. "Broken ribs, some lacerations, mild concussion. The doctors expect a full recovery thanks to your quick action." Blake nodded but said nothing. He'd learned long ago that in situations like this, the less you said, the better. She's asked me to arrange a meeting, Harrison continued. She'd like to thank you personally and discuss some opportunities that might interest you. What kind of opportunities? Morrison stepped forward slightly. Ms. Hale believes in rewarding exceptional service. She's prepared to make a substantial financial contribution to show her gratitude. We're talking about enough money to change your life, Mr. Carter. Blake felt something cold settle in his stomach. I don't want her money. Everyone wants money, Morrison said with a slight smile. It's just a question of how much. I don't. Blake stood up suddenly, feeling trapped in the small space. Look, I'm glad she's okay. That's all the thanks I need. Please tell her that. Harrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. Mr. Carter, I don't think you understand the situation here. Ms. Hale isn't just grateful, she's impressed. Do you know what that means? Blake had a feeling he was about to find out. Victoria Hale doesn't just run a construction company, Harrison continued. She's one of the most powerful people in this city. When she wants to meet someone, they meet. When she wants to help someone, they accept that help. It's not just generosity, it's good business. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Blake could feel the walls of his carefully constructed life starting to close in around him. And if I refuse, Morrison's smile widened slightly. Why would you want to do that? We're talking about a better life for you and your daughter. Better schools, better neighborhood, better opportunities. What father wouldn't want that? The mention of Emma sent a spike of anger through Blake's chest. How do you know about my daughter? We know everything we need to know, Morrison replied smoothly. 5-year-old Emma Carter attends Lincoln Elementary, currently in Mrs. Patterson's kindergarten class. Lives with her father in a 1-bedroom apartment on Rainier Avenue, mother deceased. Father works construction, no criminal record, pays his bills on time despite living paycheck to paycheck. Blake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Stay away from my daughter. Mr. Carter, Harrison interjected, his voice taking on a soothing tone. No one wants to involve your daughter in anything unpleasant. But you have to understand, Ms. Hale owes you her life. In her world, that kind of debt doesn't just disappear because you're too proud to accept gratitude. This isn't about pride. Then what is it about? Morrison asked. Because from where I'm sitting, a single father struggling to make ends meet just got offered the opportunity of a lifetime, and he's throwing it away for what, a misguided sense of nobility. Blake looked between the two men, seeing the trap they were laying, with perfect corporate precision. Accept Victoria's gratitude, and he'd become her project, her good deed, her pet working-class hero. Refuse, and they'd find other ways to show their appreciation, ways that might not be so easy to decline. I need time to think about it, he said finally. Harrison nodded as if this were exactly what he'd expected. Of course. Ms. Hale is still recovering, but she'd like to meet with you this weekend. Shall we say Saturday afternoon? I can have a car pick you up. I'll drive myself. Blake moved toward the door, but Morrison's voice stopped him. Mr. Carter, Ms. Hale isn't accustomed to being refused. I hope you'll keep that in mind. Blake left the trailer without responding, but the warning followed him out into the gray Seattle morning. Around him, the construction site buzzed with its normal, controlled chaos, but he felt disconnected from it, as if he were watching it all through glass. Mike appeared at his elbow as Blake was strapping on his tool belt. So, what did the suits want? To make my life complicated, Blake replied, checking his level and finding it perfectly straight despite the tremor in his hands. They want me to meet with her, the woman from yesterday. Victoria Hale. Mike whistled low. Hermano, that woman could buy and sell this whole company before lunch. What does she want with you? Blake started measuring out foundation stakes, focusing on the familiar rhythm of the work. To say thank you, supposedly. And you don't believe that? Blake hammered a stake into the soft ground, with more force than necessary. Rich people don't do anything without a reason. She wants something from me, I just don't know what yet. Mike was quiet for a moment, watching Blake work with the intensity of a man trying to lose himself in simple tasks. You know, when I was growing up in Guadalajara, my abuela used to tell stories about the saints. How they would sometimes walk among regular people testing them, seeing if they would do the right thing even when no one was watching, even when there was nothing to gain. Blake looked up from his measuring. What's your point? Maybe you passed some kind of test yesterday. Maybe that's why she wants to meet you. I'm not a saint, Mike. I'm just a guy who was in the right place at the right time. Are you? Mike picked up a stake and examined it with the careful attention he gave to everything on the job site. Because from what I saw on the news this morning, there were a dozen guys closer to that car than you were, but you were the only one who ran toward it instead of away. Blake didn't have an answer for that. He'd been asking himself the same question all morning, replaying those crucial seconds over and over in his mind. What had made him run? What had made him strong enough to tear open that door when adrenaline alone should have been enough? The day passed slowly, each hour marked by the growing media presence outside the construction site. By noon, there were satellite trucks from all 3 local news stations, plus CNN and Fox News. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, piecing together the story of yesterday's dramatic rescue while carefully avoiding any mention of Blake's name. But Blake knew it was only a matter of time. In the age of social media and public records, anonymity was a luxury that didn't last long. Someone would connect the dots, run his name through a database, find his address. And then what reporters camped outside Emma's school, photographers following them to the grocery store. He was still wrestling with these thoughts when his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Emma asking why news trucks on our street. What should I tell her? Blake's blood ran cold. He dropped his tools and ran for his truck, leaving Mike shouting questions behind him. The drive across town had never seemed longer traffic lights, conspiring to slow his progress, while his imagination ran wild with possibilities. What if reporters had already found Emma? What if they were asking her questions, taking her picture, turning his 5-year-old daughter into part of their story? But when he arrived at Mrs. Chen's house, he found Emma exactly where she should be, safe in the elderly woman's kitchen, helping make dumplings for dinner. The news trucks were parked on the next street over their crews, apparently focused on interviewing neighbors about Blake rather than bothering the little girl directly. Daddy! Emma ran to him with flour-covered hands, leaving white handprints on his work shirt. Mrs. Chen is teaching me to make dumplings. Want to see? Blake hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and feeling his heartbeat finally start to slow. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart, but I think maybe we should go home now. Mrs. Chen appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression was grave. They have been asking questions all day. Very polite but persistent. They want to know about you, about Emma. I tell them nothing but Blake. I know, he said quietly. Thank you for keeping her safe. As they gathered Emma's things, the little girl chattered excitedly about her day, unaware of the storm gathering around their small family. She'd made a new friend at school, learned a song about the days of the week, and convinced her teacher to let the class pet hamster visit her desk during reading time. Blake listened to her innocent excitement and felt the weight of his situation settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. How could he explain to a 5-year-old that their quiet life was about to be turned upside down? How could he make her understand that sometimes doing the right thing came with consequences you never saw coming? They were halfway home when Emma noticed the car following them. "Daddy, why is that car going the same way as us?" she asked, twisting in her car seat to look out the back window. Blake glanced in his rearview mirror and saw a black sedan keeping pace with them, 3 cars back. Professional following close enough to track his movements far enough back to avoid obvious detection. Morrison's work, almost certainly. "I don't know, sweetheart," he lied. "Probably just coincidence." But when they pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, the sedan didn't continue past. It parked across the street, its occupants clearly visible in the front seats. Watching. Waiting. Emma was tired from her long day and didn't notice the surveillance as Blake carried her upstairs to their small apartment. But he felt their eyes on him, felt the invisible tightening of the net. Victoria Hale's people were weaving around his life. Their apartment was exactly as they'd left it that morning. Toys scattered across the living room floor, breakfast dishes in the sink, Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator door. But somehow it felt different now, smaller and more vulnerable. Blake found himself checking the locks twice, making sure the curtains were closed, thinking about security in ways that had never occurred to him before. Emma fell asleep early, exhausted from her day of dumpling making and excitement. Blake tucked her into her bed and stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her small form rise and fall with each peaceful breath. She looked so young in sleep, so trusting and innocent. She believed her daddy could protect her from anything, could solve any problem, could keep their small world safe and stable forever. Blake wished he had her faith. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat at their small kitchen table, staring out the window at the black sedan still parked across the street. The men inside were probably bored by now, probably wondering why their boss cared so much about one stubborn construction worker. But Blake understood what they didn't. This wasn't really about gratitude or generosity or corporate goodwill. This was about power. About what happened when someone like Victoria Hale, someone accustomed to having her way in all things, encountered something she couldn't buy, couldn't control, couldn't simply add to her collection of obligations and favors. Blake's phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock, the unknown number flashing on the screen like a warning. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but something told him that avoiding this conversation would only make things worse. "Blake Carter," he answered. "Mr. Carter, this is Victoria Hale." Her voice was softer than he'd expected, still carrying traces of the pain medication, but unmistakably intelligent, unmistakably used to being listened to. "I hope I'm not calling too late." Blake glanced toward Emma's bedroom, where soft snoring indicated she was deep in sleep. "No, it's fine. How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you. The doctors say I'll make a full recovery." There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Blake pay closer attention. "I'm calling because I understand you've been reluctant to meet with me. My people can be persuasive sometimes. I wanted to speak with you directly." "Mrs. Hale," "Victoria, please. And before you say anything else, I want you to know that I've called off the surveillance. The men watching your apartment building have been reassigned." Blake looked out the window and saw that the black sedan was indeed gone. A small gesture, but one that told him Victoria Hale was more aware of her people's methods than she'd initially let on. "Thank you," he said. "I also want to apologize. My security team took initiative I hadn't authorized. Your daughter should never have been mentioned in any of our conversations." The sincerity in her voice caught Blake off guard. He'd been prepared for corporate manipulation, for the kind of polished charm that powerful people use to get their way. He hadn't expected this directness, accountability, what sounded like genuine regret. "I appreciate that," he said carefully. "Mr. Carter Blake, I know you don't want anything from me, My lawyers briefed me on your conversation this morning, but I need you to understand something. You saved my life. Not just my physical life, though, certainly that. You saved me from dying alone, trapped and terrified in twisted metal. When I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but wait for the end, you were there. Your voice, your hands, your presence, that's what kept me sane until help arrived. Blake closed his eyes, remembering the weight of her in his arms, the way she'd trembled against his chest as he'd carried her from the wreckage. That kind of debt, Victoria continued, it's not something I can just ignore. It's not about money or business or corporate policy. It's personal. It's human. Do you understand? I understand, Blake said quietly. But I also understand that accepting help from someone like you comes with strings attached, expectations, obligations, and I can't afford those kinds of complications in my life right now. Because of your daughter. Because of my daughter, he confirmed. Emma's world is small and safe and predictable. She's 5 years old, and she still believes that good things happen to good people, that her daddy can fix any problem, that tomorrow will be pretty much like today, only maybe a little bit better. I want to keep it that way as long as possible. Victoria was quiet for so long that Blake wondered if the connection had been lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more thoughtful. How old were you when you stopped believing that? The question hit Blake like a physical blow. He found himself thinking of his father's funeral, of standing at the graveside, holding his mother's hand while she cried for the man who'd taught Blake that doing the right thing was always worth it, even when it cost you everything. He'd been 16 and suddenly responsible for more than any teenager should have to handle. Too young, he said finally. I was 12, Victoria replied. My parents died in a plane crash and I went to live with my uncle. He wasn't cruel, just pragmatic. He taught me that sentiment was a luxury I couldn't afford, that the world was divided into winners and losers, and that good intentions were worth exactly nothing if you didn't have the power to enforce them. Blake heard something in her voice that he hadn't expected: vulnerability, maybe even loneliness. For a moment, the billionaire CEO sounded like the scared 12-year-old girl she'd once been. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Don't be. He wasn't wrong, just incomplete. Yes, the world can be brutal and unfair. Yes, power matters more than most people want to admit. But what I learned yesterday, sitting in that twisted metal, waiting to die, was that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is simply having someone care enough to help you when there's nothing in it for them. Blake didn't know how to respond to that. He'd spent 3 years learning to be both father and mother to Emma, to build their small life out of careful routines and quiet love. The idea that his simple act of human decency had shaken the worldview of someone as successful as Victoria Hale was almost too large to process. Blake, Victoria said, I'm going to ask you for something, and I want you to know that you can say no. No consequences, no pressure, no men in black sedans watching your apartment. I'm listening. Have lunch with me. Somewhere public, somewhere comfortable for you. Bring Emma if you want. I'd like to meet the little girl who's inspired such fierce protection. Let me say thank you properly, face to face, and then if you still want me to disappear from your life completely, I will. You have my word. Blake looked out the window at the empty street, thinking about Mrs. Chen's warning about Mike's story of saints walking among ordinary people, about the way his father had taught him, that sometimes you had to take risks in order to do what was right. Saturday afternoon, he said finally. There's a park near the waterfront that Emma likes. Myrtle Edwards Park, 2:00. I'll be there. Victoria's voice carried a note of something that might have been relief. And Blake, thank you for yesterday and for giving me this chance. After she hung up, Blake sat in the quiet apartment for a long time listening to the familiar sounds of his daughter's sleep and wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside, Seattle sparkled in the darkness, its lights reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. Somewhere in that glittering cityscape, Victoria Hale was probably lying in a hospital bed, planning their meeting with the same careful attention she brought to billion-dollar construction projects. And tomorrow Blake would wake up early to braid Emma's hair and make her breakfast, and pretend that their quiet life wasn't about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. The black sedan might be gone, but Blake had the feeling that Saturday afternoon would bring consequences he was only just beginning to understand. Saturday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of Seattle weather that made everything look washed out and uncertain. Blake stood in front of the bathroom mirror, running his hands through his hair for the third time and wondering why he cared how he looked for this meeting. Emma sat on the closed toilet seat behind him, swinging her legs and offering fashion advice with the serious authority that only 5-year-olds possessed. "Daddy, you should wear the blue shirt. The one with the little buttons. It makes your eyes look nice." Blake glanced at his reflection, seeing the same tired face that looked back at him every morning. Stubble that he never quite managed to shave completely, that carried the weight of 3 years' worth of single-parenting laugh lines that had deepened since Sarah's death, but somehow still made him look younger than his 28 years. "You think so?" he asked, reaching for the blue button-down that hung in the back of their shared closet. "Uh-huh. And you should comb your hair different, like this." Emma demonstrated with her own fine blonde hair, pushing it back from her forehead in a way that made her look startlingly like her mother. The resemblance hit Blake like it always did, sudden and breathtaking, and tinged with a grief that never quite went away. Sarah had been gone for 3 years, but sometimes Emma would tilt her head or laugh or make that exact same gesture, and for a moment it was like having his wife back in the room with them. "Perfect," he said, ruffling Emma's hair gently. "What would I do without my style consultant?" Emma giggled, a sound that always made Blake's chest feel lighter, no matter how heavy the day seemed. She was wearing her favorite purple dress, the one with the unicorns that she'd picked out for what she called meeting the nice lady from Daddy's work. Blake had been careful about how he'd explained today's meeting. Emma knew that her daddy had helped someone who got hurt, and that someone wanted to say thank you. She didn't know about the twisted steel or the blood or the way Victoria Hale's eyes had looked in those first few seconds after he'd pulled her from the wreckage, desperate and grateful and intensely alive. The drive to Myrtle Edwards Park took them along the waterfront past the piers where ferries loaded passengers for weekend trips to the islands. Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the seagulls dive for scraps, while Blake's mind wandered to the phone call he'd received that morning. "Mr. Carter." The voice had been crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Patricia Williams, Ms. Hale's personal assistant. I'm calling to confirm your meeting today and to let you know that Ms. Hale will be arriving by private car. She wanted me to ask if there's anything your daughter might particularly enjoy, ice cream perhaps, or something from the park's concession stand." The thoughtfulness of the gesture had surprised Blake almost as much as the fact that Victoria Hale had remembered Emma would be coming. Most people in her position, he imagined, wouldn't think about what a 5-year-old might want at a business meeting disguised as a casual lunch. "Ice cream is always a hit," he'd told Patricia. "But she doesn't need to. Ms. Hale insists," Patricia had interrupted gently. "She's looking forward to meeting Emma." Now, as they pulled into the park's small parking lot, Blake wondered what Victoria Hale would make of his daughter's boundless energy and endless questions. Emma had been talking non-stop since they'd left the apartment a steady stream of observations about clouds and seagulls, and the way the water looked like wrinkled silver under the overcast sky. "Is that her daddy?" Emma pointed toward a black town car parked near the park's entrance, its windows tinted dark enough to hide the occupants. "I think so," Blake said, though he wasn't sure until he saw the woman getting out of the passenger side. Victoria Hale looked different than she had in the twisted remains of her Mercedes. The blood and concrete dust were gone, replaced by careful makeup that couldn't quite hide the bruising around her left temple. She was dressed casually, designer jeans and a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than Blake made in a month, but there was nothing casual about the way she moved. Even with one arm in a sling and obvious soreness in her movements, she carried herself with the kind of unconscious authority that came from years of being the most important person in any room she entered. But when she saw Emma skipping toward her across the grass, something in her expression softened completely. "You must be Emma," Victoria said, crouching down to the little girl's eye level, despite what the movement clearly cost her injured ribs. "I'm Victoria. Your daddy told me a lot about you." Emma studied Victoria with the frank curiosity of childhood, taking in the expensive clothes and perfect hair and the sling that held Victoria's left arm against her chest. "Are you hurt bad?" Emma asked with the directness that always made Blake hold his breath. "Not too bad," Victoria replied seriously, as if Emma's question deserved a real answer. "Your daddy helped me when I was scared, and now I'm getting better." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened, as she noticed something Blake had missed, a small pink bag sitting on the park bench behind Victoria. "Is that for me?" Victoria's smile was genuine, transforming her face from beautiful but remote to something warmer and more accessible. "It might be. What do you think?" Emma looked up at Blake, who nodded his permission. The bag contained a small stuffed otter, the kind they sold at the Seattle Aquarium, along with a coloring book about marine animals and a box of crayons that were clearly expensive, the kind that came in more colors than Blake knew existed. "Oh, wow!" Emma clutched the otter to her chest, her eyes wide with delight. "Daddy, look, she's so soft." "What do you say, sweetheart?" Blake prompted. "Thank you." Emma threw her free arm around Victoria's neck in an enthusiastic hug that made Victoria wince slightly, but return with surprising warmth. Watching them together, Blake felt something complicated twist in his chest. This was the woman who commanded billion-dollar construction projects, who negotiated with senators and made hardened businessmen nervous with a single glance. But right now, she was sitting on a park bench, letting a 5-year-old show her the proper way to pet a stuffed otter, and she looked genuinely happy to be doing it. "Shall we walk?" Victoria suggested, after Emma had finished her detailed introduction of the otter who had been promptly named Splash. "I thought we might get some ice cream from the vendor near the sculpture park." They started down the path that ran along Elliott Bay, Emma skipping ahead, with Splash clutched in one hand and her coloring book tucked under her other arm. The weather was holding still gray, but no longer threatening rain, and the weekend crowd was light. Dog walkers and joggers shared the path with families and tourists, everyone moving at the unhurried pace that Seattle weekends demanded. "She's beautiful," Victoria said quietly, watching Emma stop to examine every interesting rock and flower along the way. "She has your eyes, but there's something else there too." "Her mother," Blake said simply. "Sarah. Emma's got her curiosity, her way of seeing wonder in everything." Victoria glanced at him sideways, and Blake realized he'd volunteered more personal information than he'd intended. But something about the way she'd interacted with Emma, the genuine warmth in her response to his daughter's enthusiasm, had lowered his defenses without him noticing. "You mentioned that she'd passed away," Victoria said carefully. "I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult." Blake watched Emma crouch down to show Splash a particularly interesting seashell, her purple dress bright against the gray sand. Car accident. 3 years ago. Emma was only 2, so she doesn't really remember much about her mother. Sometimes I think that's a blessing. Sometimes I think it's the cruelest thing in the world. What do you think today? The question caught Blake off guard with its directness. He looked at Victoria more closely, noting the way she seemed to be really listening, not just making polite conversation while they walked. Today, I think she's lucky to be young enough to believe that the world is mostly good, that people help each other because it's the right thing to do, and that her daddy can protect her from anything that might hurt her. Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching Emma chase a seagull that was clearly enjoying the game more than it was fleeing from it. "Is that what you believed when you were fair?" she asked. Blake thought about his childhood in Spokane, about his father coming home from construction sites covered in dust and exhaustion, but always having time for bedtime stories and homework help, about his mother making pancakes on Saturday mornings, and the way his parents would dance in the kitchen while they did dishes thinking he was asleep. "Yeah," he said. "I did. Right up until I was 16, and my dad got diagnosed with lung cancer. Mesothelioma from all the years working with asbestos, before anyone knew how dangerous it was. That's when you learned that good intentions weren't enough. That's when I learned that the world doesn't care how good a person you are, or how hard you work, or how much you love your family. Sometimes bad things just happen, and all you can do is figure out how to keep going." Victoria stopped walking, her expression thoughtful. "Is that why you don't want to accept help from me? Because you think it means admitting that hard work and good intentions aren't enough?" Blake considered the question while Emma discovered a tide pool that had somehow formed in the rocks near the path. It was more complicated than that, but Victoria had touched on something true. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly it's because I've seen what happens when people like me get involved with people like you. I become a project, a cause, a way for you to feel good about giving back to the community. And maybe that works for a while. Maybe you set up a college fund for Emma, or get me a better job, or whatever, but eventually, you move on to the next crisis, the next opportunity to be generous, and I'm left trying to explain to my daughter why the fairy tale ended." Victoria's green eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, but when she spoke, her voice was controlled, measured. "People like me," she repeated. "What exactly does that mean, Blake? Rich, powerful, used to getting what you want." He met her gaze, directly refusing to back down from the conversation he'd started. "Used to being able to solve problems by throwing money at them. And you think that's what I'm trying to do here? Solve you like a problem?" Emma's voice interrupted them before Blake could answer. "Daddy, come look at the crabs. There's babies." Blake crouched down beside his daughter, grateful for the distraction and the chance to collect his thoughts. The tide pool was teeming with life, tiny crabs scuttling between rocks, sea anemones waving their tentacles in the shallow water, hermit crabs dragging their borrowed shells across the sandy bottom. "Wow," he said, matching Emma's wonder. "Look at that big one. I bet he's the king of the tide pool." Emma giggled, then looked up at Victoria, who had joined them beside the water. "Do you want to see the king crab?" Victoria knelt carefully beside them, her designer jeans getting damp from the wet sand. "I'd love to." For the next 10 minutes, they were just 3 people crouched beside a tide pool, watching Emma point out every creature she could find, while Victoria asked questions that showed she was genuinely interested in the answers. The tension of their earlier conversation seemed to dissolve in the face of Emma's infectious enthusiasm, and Victoria's surprisingly patient engagement with her detailed explanations of crab behavior. When Emma finally tired of the tide pool and ran ahead to find the ice cream vendor, Victoria stood slowly brushing sand from her knees. "To answer your question," she said quietly. "No, I don't think you're a problem to be solved, but I do think you're wrong about what this is." Blake straightened, waiting for her to continue. "You saved my life, Blake. Not because you wanted something from me, not because you thought it would benefit you somehow, but because it was the right thing to do. That's not common in my world. Hell, it's not common in any world. It should be. Yes, it should be, but it's not." Victoria watched Emma negotiate with the ice cream vendor, her small hands counting out coins from the change purse Blake had given her. "Do you know what I was doing in that car when the beam fell? I was reviewing a proposal to tear down a low-income housing complex so I could build luxury condos. 300 families displaced, but the profit margins were too good to pass up." Blake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And now I'm having second thoughts. Not because it's not profitable, but because I keep thinking about what you said that night on the phone. About Emma's world being small and safe and predictable. About wanting to keep it that way." Victoria's voice carried a weight Blake hadn't heard before, as if she were working through something in real time. "Those 300 families, they have kids too. Kids who believe the world is mostly good, that their parents can protect them from anything. What happens to that belief when they get evicted so I can make another few $1,000,000? Emma bounded back toward them, clutching a strawberry ice cream cone that was already beginning to drip down her wrist. "Victoria, I got you one too," the man said. "Strawberry is the best flavor, but I told him you might like vanilla, because you seem like a vanilla person. But then I thought maybe you'd want to try strawberry, because it's my favorite, so I got you strawberry. But if you don't like it, I can eat it and you can have some of mine." Victoria accepted the ice cream with a smile that transformed her face completely. "Strawberry is perfect. Thank you, Emma." They found a bench overlooking the water. Emma between them, all three working on their ice cream, while ferries crisscrossed the bay in the distance. Emma chattered about everything and nothing, the seagulls, the boats, the way her ice cream was exactly the same color as her dress if you looked at it in the right light. Blake found himself relaxing despite the complexity of the conversation he'd been having with Victoria. There was something about Emma's presence that made everything simpler, more immediate. Whatever larger questions existed about debt and gratitude, and the intersection of their two worlds right now, there was just ice cream and a little girl's laughter and the peaceful rhythm of waves against the shore. "Daddy," Emma said suddenly, "is Victoria going to be our friend now?" Blake glanced at Victoria, who was watching Emma, with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "I think she should be. She bought me ice cream, and she knows about crabs, and she doesn't talk to me like I'm a baby." "Those are pretty good qualifications for friendship," Victoria said solemnly. Emma nodded firmly as if the matter were settled. "Good, because Splash likes you, and otters are very good judges of character." After Emma finished her ice cream and ran off to investigate a group of children flying kites nearby, Blake and Victoria sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon light play across the water. "She's remarkable," Victoria said eventually. "You've done something incredible with her, Blake. She's confident and curious and kind. That doesn't happen by accident." Blake felt a flush of pride that he tried to keep from showing. "She's easy to love. Makes the job simpler." "Does it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the hardest job in the world." Victoria's voice was thoughtful, almost wistful, trying to protect someone's innocence while still preparing them for reality, wanting to give them everything while teaching them that they can't have everything, loving them enough to let them make their own mistakes. And there was something in her tone that made Blake study her profile more carefully. Do you have kids? Victoria shook her head, still watching Emma play with the other children. No, I always told myself there wasn't time, that building the company had to come first. And then one day I woke up and realized I was 34 years old and I'd spent so much time accumulating power that I'd forgotten what I wanted to use it for. It's not too late. Isn't it? Victoria turned to look at him, and Blake saw something vulnerable in her expression, something that the expensive clothes and careful makeup couldn't hide. I don't know how to be around children. I don't know how to talk to them or what they need or how to make them feel safe. I've spent 15 years learning how to intimidate people, how to negotiate from a position of strength, how to make sure I never show weakness. Those aren't exactly parenting skills. Blake watched Emma teaching one of the other children how to hold a kite string properly, her natural generosity and patience on full display. Maybe not, he said, but you knew to get her an otter instead of something flashy. You listened when she talked about crabs like it was the most important conversation in the world. You asked her opinion about ice cream flavors instead of just ordering for her. Those aren't negotiation tactics, Victoria. Those are just ways of treating a child like a person. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Blake wondered if he'd overstepped somehow. But when she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it before. My uncle used to say that emotional attachments were liabilities, that caring about people gave them power over you, and power was the only thing that mattered. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I spent 20 years believing that, Blake. 20 years building walls and calculating advantages and making sure I never needed anyone more than they needed me. What changed? Tuesday afternoon, she said simply. Sitting in that twisted metal, unable to move, unable to think, completely helpless for maybe the first time in my adult life. And then you were there. You didn't know who I was, didn't know what I could do for you or to you. You just saw someone who needed help, and you helped. Emma came running back to them, her cheeks flushed from playing, and her hair escaping from the careful braid Blake had woven that morning. Daddy, can we come back next week? Jenny's mom says they come here every Saturday, and Jenny wants to show me the place where the seals sometimes come up on the rocks. Blake glanced at Victoria, who was smiling at Emma's enthusiasm. We'll see, sweetheart. Saturday's our day for adventures. What kind of adventures? Victoria asked. Emma launched into a detailed recounting of their Saturday routines, the farmer's market, where Blake bought coffee, and Emma picked out fruit, the library where she could check out as many books as she could carry, the park near their apartment, where Blake pushed her on the swings until his arms got tired. It sounds perfect, Victoria said, and she sounded like she meant it. It's nothing fancy, Blake said, suddenly conscious of how simple their life must sound to someone who could afford anything she wanted. No, Victoria agreed. It sounds like everything I never knew I was missing. Emma climbed onto the bench between them, holding Splash up so the stuffed otter could see the water. Victoria, do you have Saturday adventures? Victoria considered the question seriously. Not the way you do. I usually work on Saturdays, or go to meetings, or read reports about business things that probably aren't very interesting to most people. Emma's face scrunched up in concentration. That doesn't sound very fun. It's not really. Victoria looked out at the water where a ferry was making its slow way toward the islands. But it's what I know how to do. Daddy could teach you about fun Saturday things, Emma announced with the confidence of someone who believed all problems had simple solutions. He's really good at adventures, and he makes the best pancakes in the whole world. Blake felt his face flush. Emma, I don't think Victoria... Actually, Victoria interrupted, her voice careful. I'd like that, if you wouldn't mind the company. Blake met her eyes, seeing something there that looked almost like loneliness, almost like hope. It would be easy to say no, to keep their worlds separate, to maintain the careful distance that protected both of them from complications neither of them was ready for. But Emma was looking at him with that bright expectation that had been shaping his decisions for 3 years now. And Victoria was looking at him like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be invited somewhere just because people enjoyed her company. "Next Saturday," he heard himself say. 8:30 at the farmer's market. Emma likes to get there early for the best strawberries. Victoria's smile was radiant. "I'll be there." As they walked back toward the parking lot, Emma skipping ahead with Splash tucked safely under her arm, Blake wondered what he'd just set in motion. Victoria Hale in her designer clothes sampling organic produce and watching Emma negotiate with vendors over the price of apples. It should have been an absurd image, but somehow it felt right. "Blake," Victoria said quietly as they reached her car, "I want you to know that this isn't about charity. It isn't about paying you back or assuaging my guilt or adding you to some list of good deeds. This is about the first real conversation I've had in years, and the first time in longer than I can remember that someone invited me somewhere without wanting something from me." Blake studied her face, looking for the calculation, the hidden agenda, the corporate strategy disguised as personal connection. But all he saw was a woman who'd spent so many years building walls that she'd forgotten what it felt like when someone offered to let her through the gate. "Same time next week," he said. After Victoria's car disappeared into traffic, Blake and Emma walked slowly back to their pickup truck. Emma was tired from the afternoon's excitement, her energy finally flagging as the day caught up with her. "Daddy," she said, as he lifted her into her car seat. "I like Victoria. She's sad, but she's nice." Blake paused in the middle of fastening her seatbelt. "What makes you think she's sad?" Emma considered this with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes displayed. Her eyes, "They're like yours used to be right after Mommy went to heaven. But then she smiled at me and they got happy. I think maybe she just needs more practice smiling." Blake finished with the seatbelt and kissed Emma's forehead, marveling once again at his daughter's ability to see straight through to the heart of things that adults spent years trying to understand. "You might be right about that, sweetheart." As they drove home through the late afternoon traffic, Emma dozed in her car seat, clutching Splash and the coloring book, completely satisfied with her day. But Blake's mind was racing, replaying conversations and gestures and the way Victoria had looked when Emma hugged her, surprised and touched, and something else that might have been hunger. He'd agreed to let Victoria into their Saturday routine, into the small, careful world he'd built for Emma. It was either the most generous thing he'd ever done or the most dangerous, and he wasn't sure he'd know which until it was too late to change his mind. But as he pulled into their apartment complex and saw Emma's peaceful face in the rearview mirror, Blake realized that maybe some risks were worth taking. Maybe some walls were meant to be opened even if you weren't sure what would come through. Next Saturday would tell him which kind of risk he'd chosen. The week between Saturdays passed differently than Blake had expected. Instead of the usual rhythm of work and Emma's school schedule and evening routines, he found himself thinking about Victoria at odd moments, while pouring concrete, while helping Emma with her kindergarten homework, while lying awake in the quiet hours after midnight. Not romantic thoughts exactly, but something more complicated. The memory of her vulnerability, when she'd talked about never learning how to be around children, the way her entire posture had changed when Emma hugged her, the genuine surprise in her voice when she'd said it was the first real conversation she'd had in years. Emma, meanwhile, had incorporated Victoria seamlessly into her understanding of the world. She'd named the stuffed otter Splash Victoria Carter, insisting that since Victoria was going to be their friend, the otter needed her full name too. She'd colored 3 pages in the marine animal book specifically to show Victoria on Saturday, and she'd announced to Mrs. Chen that they were going to teach a nice lady about strawberries and pancakes, because she'd been too busy working to learn about fun things. "This Victoria Mrs." Chen had said to Blake while Emma practiced writing letters at the kitchen table. "She is an important person, yes." Blake had nodded, not trusting himself to explain the complexity of what Victoria represented without sounding either dismissive or overly impressed. "Important people, they have important problems," Mrs. Chen continued, her weathered hands, busy with the tea she always made when she had something significant to say. "But children, they see past the important to the person underneath. Emma likes this woman, so there is good in her. But Blake..." She'd paused, fixing him with the look that always made him feel like she could see straight through to his soul. "Important people also have important power. Be careful you don't lose yourself trying to help her find herself." Now it was Friday evening, and Blake was second-guessing everything. What had possessed him to invite Victoria Hale to their farmer's market routine? What was he supposed to talk to her about while Emma ran between the vegetable stands? How was he supposed to explain to the vendors who knew them, who'd watched Emma grow from a toddler to a chatty kindergartner, that the impeccably dressed woman browsing organic kale was the billionaire CEO who'd been on the front page of the Seattle Times business section just last week? "Daddy, are you worried about tomorrow?" Emma asked from her spot on the living room floor, where she was arranging her crayons in rainbow order for the 3rd time. Blake looked up from the construction invoice he'd been staring at without reading for the past 10 minutes. "What makes you think I'm worried?" Emma gave him the patient look she'd perfected over the past year, the one that said she was 5 years old, but she wasn't stupid. "You keep making that face you make when you're thinking about grown-up things that you don't like." Blake had to smile at that. His daughter's emotional intelligence never ceased to amaze him. Sarah had been the same way, able to read his moods from across a room, able to tell when he was carrying worries he hadn't even admitted to himself. "I'm not worried exactly," he said, setting aside the invoice and sitting on the floor beside her. "But I want to make sure Victoria has a good time. She's not used to doing things like farmers' markets and pancake breakfasts." Emma nodded seriously, then brightened as if she'd just solved a complex puzzle. "Oh, she's like Jenny's mom when Jenny's mom came to story time at school. She was all nervous because she didn't know the songs we sing, but then Mrs. Patterson taught her, and she had the best time ever." Blake considered this comparison. Jenny's mom was a software engineer who worked from home and had been intimidated by the prospect of participating in kindergarten activities. Victoria Hale was a billionaire who commanded corporate empires and negotiated with senators. The scale was slightly different. "Something like that," he agreed. "Well, that's easy then," Emma announced, with the confidence of someone who'd just solved world hunger. "We'll just teach her all our favorite things, and then she'll know how to have fun. Like showing her where Mr. Peterson keeps the best apples, and how to tell if the bread from the bakery ladies is still warm, and why you have to get to the flower stand early before all the pretty ones are gone." Blake felt something ease in his chest. Leave it to Emma to reduce the complexity of class differences and social awkwardness to a simple matter of sharing knowledge. In her world, problems had solutions, and the solution to someone not knowing how to have fun was to teach them. "You're pretty smart, you know that," he said, dropping a kiss on top of her head. Emma beamed. "I get it from you, Daddy." Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, one of those perfect Seattle days when the mountains seemed close enough to touch and the air tasted like possibilities. Blake stood in front of the bathroom mirror once again, second-guessing his clothing choices, while Emma provided commentary from her perch on the closed toilet seat. "The green shirt," she decided after careful consideration. "It matches your eyes. And Victoria likes green. I can tell because her eyes are green too, and people usually like colors that look like them." Blake wasn't sure that was how color preference worked, but he pulled on the green flannel anyway. Emma had chosen her own outfit with equal care jeans with sparkly patches on the knees and a sweatshirt that featured a smiling octopus. She'd braided Splash Victoria Carter into her hair, like a headband, the stuffed otter's small paws barely visible among the blonde strands. They arrived at Pike Place Market early, as was their tradition, finding a parking spot on the street that would normally be impossible later in the morning when the tourist crowds descended. Blake had suggested meeting at the smaller University District Farmers Market, thinking it might be less overwhelming for Victoria, but Emma had insisted on their usual spot. "This is where we always come," she'd explained with 5-year-old logic. "If we go somewhere different, it won't be our real Saturday adventure." Blake spotted Victoria before she saw them, and for a moment, he wondered if she'd somehow gotten the location wrong. She was standing near the entrance to the market, but she looked nothing like the polished CEO he'd met in the hospital, or even the casually dressed woman from the park. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was wearing jeans, actual jeans, not the designer version, and a University of Washington sweatshirt that looked like it had been acquired honestly rather than purchased for the occasion. She was studying the market layout with the same intensity she probably brought to corporate acquisitions, and there was something almost vulnerable about her concentration. "Victoria." Emma broke away from Blake's hand and ran toward her, the stuffed otter bouncing in her hair. Victoria's face transformed when she saw Emma approaching the careful mask of preparation, giving way to genuine pleasure. She crouched down to Emma's level, and Blake noticed that she moved more easily than she had the previous weekend, her injuries healing. "Good morning, Emma. I love your sweatshirt. Is that an octopus?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "His name is Dr. Tentacles, and he's very smart. He can solve puzzles and open jars and change colors when he's scared. Did you know octopuses have 3 hearts?" "I didn't know that," Victoria said seriously. "That's fascinating. Do all octopuses have 3 hearts?" As Emma launched into everything she knew about octopus biology, which was considerable thanks to a recent library book obsession, Blake caught up to them, noting the way Victoria listened with complete attention, asking follow-up questions that showed she was genuinely interested rather than just being polite. "You look different," Emma announced when she'd finished her octopus lecture. Victoria glanced down at her clothes self-consciously. "Different how?" Emma studied her with the frank assessment that children specialized in. "More like a regular person. I like it. It makes your face look softer." Blake felt his cheeks warm at his daughter's directness, but Victoria just laughed. "Thank you, Emma. I think that might be the nicest compliment I've gotten in years." They started through the market, Emma leading the way with the confidence of a seasoned guide. She knew every vendor, every shortcut, every hidden corner where interesting things might be found. Victoria followed gamely, her expensive purse replaced by a simple canvas tote bag that Emma had declared perfect for carrying their purchases. Their first stop was Peterson's Produce, where Emma greeted the elderly vendor like an old friend and immediately began explaining to Victoria the proper technique for selecting apples. "You have to check for soft spots," Emma said seriously, turning a Honeycrisp in her small hands. "And it should smell like apple, but not too much apple smell because that means it's getting old." Victoria accepted the apple Emma handed her, examining it with the same careful attention. "Like this." "Perfect, Mr. Peterson. This is Victoria. She's learning about apples." Harold Peterson, who had been selling produce at the market for 30 years, looked Victoria up and down with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd seen every type of customer imaginable. Blake held his breath, wondering if he recognized her from the news coverage, but the old man just nodded approvingly. "First time at the market?" he asked Victoria. Yes, and Emma's teaching me everything I need to know. Peterson's weathered face creased into a smile. Well, you couldn't ask for a better teacher. This little one knows quality when she sees it. He selected a particularly beautiful gala apple and handed it to Emma. For your friend to try, on the house. Victoria accepted the apple with a grace that impressed Blake. There was no condescension, no obvious awareness of the class difference between herself and the produce vendor. She bit into the apple, her eyes widening at the taste. That's incredible, she said to Peterson. Where do you source these? Got my own orchards about an hour outside the city. Been in my family for 4 generations. The terroir must be perfect for apples. You can taste the complexity, there's honey notes, but also something almost floral. Peterson's eyebrows rose, clearly impressed by Victoria's palate. You know about apples? Victoria flushed slightly. I know about agriculture in general. It's part of my business to understand land use and soil composition, but I've never tasted anything this good from a commercial orchard. That's because this isn't commercial, Peterson said with pride. This is artisanal. Small batch careful cultivation picked at perfect ripeness, instead of when it's convenient for shipping. Emma tugged on Victoria's hand. Can we get some for pancakes tomorrow? Daddy makes the best apple pancakes when we have really good apples. Victoria looked at Blake questioningly, and he found himself nodding before he'd really thought about it. If you'd like to join us for breakfast tomorrow, it's kind of become our Sunday tradition. I'd love that, Victoria said, and Blake could see that she meant it. They bought a bag of mixed apples, Peterson throwing in an extra Honey Crisp for the road. As they walked away, Emma skipping between them, Victoria turned to Blake with an expression he couldn't quite read. He didn't recognize me, she said quietly. Blake had noticed that too. Does that bother you? Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching Emma investigate a display of pumpkins at the next stand. No, she said finally. It's actually the most refreshing thing that's happened to me in years. He judged me on my ability to recognize good apples, not on my net worth or my corporate reputation. Their next stop was the bakery stand where Emma introduced Victoria to Sarah and Margaret, the sisters, who had been baking bread for the market since before Emma was born. The older women fussed over Emma the way grandmothers did, asking about school and commenting on how much she'd grown since last week. And who's this lovely young lady? Sarah asked, smiling at Victoria. This is Victoria, Emma announced. She's learning about Saturday adventures, and she's going to eat pancakes with us tomorrow. Margaret, who had flour permanently embedded under her fingernails, and the warm, yeasty smell of bread in her clothes, handed Victoria a sample of their cinnamon swirl bread. First time at the market? Victoria nodded, tasting the bread, and closing her eyes in appreciation. This is extraordinary. Do you use a sourdough starter? 5 generations old, Margaret said proudly. My great-great-grandmother brought it over from Germany in 1887. We've been feeding it and caring for it ever since. Victoria's eyes widened. You mean this bread shares DNA with bread that was made over a century ago? In a way, yes. Sarah joined the conversation, clearly pleased by Victoria's genuine interest. The yeast cultures in a starter like that develop unique characteristics over time. This bread doesn't just taste different from commercial bread, it's literally a different organism. Blake watched Victoria's face as she processed this information, seeing something there that looked like wonder. She asked intelligent questions about fermentation times and flour types, and the sisters warmed to her immediately, eventually insisting she take an extra loaf to keep you going until next week. As they walked away with their arms full of bread, Emma looked up at Victoria with approval. You're good at this. Good at what? Talking to people about things they care about. Mrs. Patterson says that's how you make friends. You listen to what makes people happy, and you ask questions about it. Victoria glanced at Blake over Emma's head, and he saw something vulnerable in her expression again. Your teacher sounds very wise. She is. She says the most important thing about people is what makes their eyes light up when they talk about it. Like yours did when you were talking about the bread being different organisms. Victoria stopped walking, looking down at Emma with an expression of genuine surprise. My eyes lit up. Emma nodded seriously. Uh-huh. Just like Daddy's do when he talks about building things, or like mine do when I talk about ocean animals. Blake felt something shift inside his chest as he watched Victoria process this observation. When had she last had someone notice what made her happy? When had she last been in a conversation where her enthusiasm was welcomed rather than calculated for strategic advantage? They continued through the market, Emma leading them from stand to stand with the confidence of a seasoned guide. At the cheese counter, Victoria learned about aging caves and the difference between grass-fed and grain-fed dairy. At the flower stand, she helped Emma select a small bouquet of daffodils for Mrs. Chen, listening carefully to Emma's explanation of which colors looked best together. By the time they'd completed their circuit of the market, Victoria's canvas bag was full, and her cheeks were flushed from the cool morning air, and what Blake suspected was genuine happiness. She'd talked to more strangers in 2 hours than she probably usually spoke to in a week, outside of business contexts, and each conversation had been natural, unguarded, real. Coffee, Blake suggested, nodding toward the small cafe at the edge of the market. Yes, please, Victoria said, then looked down at Emma. What about you hot chocolate? Emma's eyes lit up. With marshmallows, as many marshmallows as you want. They found a small table outside despite the cool air, because Emma insisted that the pigeons were more interesting from the patio. Victoria cradled her coffee cup in both hands, looking out at the bustling market with an expression Blake couldn't quite identify. This is incredible, she said quietly. I had no idea places like this existed. Blake followed her gaze, seeing the market through her eyes. The vendors who knew their customers by name, the families with children, weaving between the stalls, the elderly couples sharing samples and debating the merits of different honey varieties. It was a world built on relationships and quality, and the simple pleasure of choosing your food from people who'd grown or made it themselves. Emma and I started coming here right after Sarah died, Blake said. I was struggling with grocery shopping. Everything felt overwhelming. Too many choices, too many reminders of the way Sarah used to plan meals and make lists and know exactly what we needed. But here you just walk around until something looks good and everyone's happy to tell you about what they're selling. It felt manageable. Victoria nodded, understanding immediately. And Emma? Blake glanced at his daughter, who was systematically dissolving marshmallows in her hot chocolate and narrating the process under her breath. She loved it from the first day. She'd never been around so many people who were excited to see her, who remembered her from week to week, and asked about her drawings and her loose teeth and whatever book she was obsessed with. It became our thing. Your Saturday adventure, Victoria said, echoing Emma's phrase. Our Saturday adventure, Blake confirmed. Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching Emma attempt to balance a marshmallow on her spoon. Blake, can I ask you something? He nodded. Why did you invite me to be part of this? Your Saturday routine is obviously precious to you and Emma. It's your time together, your tradition. Why share it with someone you barely know? Blake had been asking himself the same question all week. He looked at Victoria, really looked at her, seeing past the expensive haircut and the careful makeup to the woman underneath. Someone who'd spent so many years building walls that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be invited inside. Because Emma was right, he said finally. You looked sad. And because I remember what it was like after Sarah died, feeling like I'd forgotten how to connect with people, how to have conversations that weren't about work, or Emma's schedule, or the logistics of single parenting. You do things for people not because you expect something back, but because everyone deserves to remember what it feels like to belong somewhere. Victoria's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. I haven't belonged anywhere in a very long time. Emma looked up from her marshmallow experiment, her face serious. You belong with us now, she said matter-of-factly. Right, Daddy? Blake met Victoria's eyes across the small table, seeing hope and fear and gratitude all mixed together in her expression. Right, he said. The moment stretched between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to examine too closely. But Emma, with the perfect timing that children sometimes possessed, chose that moment to accidentally knock over her hot chocolate, sending a wave of chocolate and melted marshmallows across the table. The crisis of cleanup and reassurance and ordering a replacement hot chocolate broke the intensity of the moment. But Blake noticed that Victoria's smile when she helped Emma mop up the spill was softer than he'd ever seen it. And when Emma grabbed Victoria's hand to lead her back to the market for one final loop to see if any new vendors had set up, Victoria's fingers closed around the small hand with a tenderness that made Blake's chest tight. They spent another hour wandering through the market, Emma showing Victoria hidden corners she'd missed on their first pass, Victoria asking questions that demonstrated she was genuinely engaged with everything she saw. By the time they walked back toward the parking area, all three of them were carrying bags, and Victoria was laughing at something Emma had said about the politics of pigeon behavior. What time tomorrow? Victoria asked as they reached her car, a different car than she'd driven to the park, Blake noted. This one was smaller, more practical, the kind of vehicle someone might drive if they actually needed to park in normal spaces and navigate city traffic like everyone else. 9 o'clock, Blake suggested. Emma likes to help with the pancakes, so if you come early she can show you her technique. I wouldn't miss it, Victoria said, and Blake believed her. Emma hugged Victoria goodbye, the gesture natural and unself-conscious, and Blake felt something settle into place in his chest. Whatever this was, friendship, charity, mutual need, dressed up as casual kindness, Emma had claimed Victoria as part of their small family. And watching Victoria hug his daughter back, seeing the genuine affection in her face, Blake realized that maybe the risk he'd taken was already paying off in ways he hadn't expected. As Victoria's car disappeared into traffic, Emma took Blake's hand and looked up at him with satisfaction. She had fun, Emma announced. I could tell because she stopped looking around like she was waiting for something bad to happen. Blake squeezed his daughter's hand, marveling once again at her insight into the adults around her. You're pretty observant, you know that. Emma nodded seriously. It's important to pay attention to people's feelings. That's how you know if they need extra kindness, or if they're ready for jokes, or if they just want someone to listen to them. As they drove home through the Saturday afternoon traffic, Blake found himself looking forward to tomorrow morning in a way he hadn't anticipated. Victoria Hale, Billionaire CEO, was coming to their small apartment to learn how to make pancakes from a 5-year-old. She was going to sit at their kitchen table and eat breakfast off their mismatched plates and probably get flour in her expensive hair. And somehow that felt like exactly the right thing for all of them. But as Blake carried their farmers market purchases up the stairs to their apartment, he couldn't quite shake Mrs. Chen's warning about the dangers of important people with important problems. Victoria had seemed genuinely happy today, genuinely engaged with their simple Saturday routine. But she was still Victoria Hale, still the woman who could buy and sell his entire world without noticing the expense. Tomorrow morning would tell him whether the woman who'd laughed at Emma's pigeon observations Was the real Victoria Hale, or just another carefully constructed persona designed to get what she wanted? Either way, Emma was already planning the pancake lesson, with the enthusiasm she brought to all her favorite projects. And Blake had made a promise to a little girl who believed that teaching someone how to have fun was the most important job in the world. He just hoped he was right to trust that belief. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of soft rain that Seattle was famous for, the droplets so fine they seemed suspended in the air rather than actually falling. Blake woke before his alarm, as he always did. But instead of the usual quiet contemplation of his coffee, he found himself checking the apartment with new eyes. How would their small space look to Victoria? The living room where Emma's toys lived in organized chaos. The kitchen with its mismatched dishes and the pancake griddle that had been a wedding gift from Sarah's mother. The single bathroom they shared with its collection of Emma's rubber ducks lined up along the tub's edge. Emma was already awake when he peeked into her room, sitting cross-legged on her bed, with Splash Victoria Carter in her lap, having what appeared to be a serious conversation with the stuffed otter about proper pancake-making protocol. "Good morning, sweetheart," Blake said, settling on the edge of her bed. "Ready for your cooking lesson?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I've been explaining to Splash about how you have to be very gentle with the batter, because if you stir it too much, the pancakes get tough, and about how you can tell when they're ready to flip because they get little bubbles on top." Blake smiled, remembering the first time he'd attempted to make pancakes after Sarah's death. Emma had been 2.5 sitting in her high chair crying because the pancakes didn't taste like Mommy's. It had taken him months of trial and error to develop their current recipe, which was really Sarah's recipe, modified through necessity and improved through Emma's exacting standards. "Think Victoria will be a good student?" he asked. Emma considered this seriously. "She's good at asking questions, and she listened to all the market people yesterday. Plus, she likes trying new things. I think she'll be excellent at pancakes once she learns the tricks." At exactly 9 o'clock, Victoria knocked on their door. Blake opened it to find her standing in the hallway, holding a small paper bag, and wearing an expression of nervous anticipation that was so different from her usual composed confidence that it took him a moment to respond. "Good morning," she said, offering the bag. "I brought real maple syrup. The woman at the market yesterday said Peterson's apples deserved the best, so I thought—" She trailed off suddenly, looking uncertain. "Is that okay? I wasn't sure what to bring to a pancake lesson." Emma appeared at Blake's elbow, still in her pajamas, but with her hair carefully brushed and pulled back with a headband that featured tiny pancakes. "Victoria, you came to— Did you bring your appetite?" Victoria's face relaxed into a genuine smile. "I brought the biggest appetite I could manage, and I'm ready to learn everything you can teach me about pancakes." Emma grabbed Victoria's hand and pulled her into the kitchen, chattering about the morning's agenda, while Blake hung Victoria's jacket. A simple raincoat, he noticed, not the expensive wool coat she'd worn to their first meeting, on the hook by the door. The kitchen was small, barely big enough for 2 adults and one enthusiastic 5-year-old, but somehow they made it work. Emma appointed herself head instructor, positioning Victoria at the counter, while she explained the importance of having all ingredients at room temperature. "See if the eggs are too cold, they don't mix right with the milk," Emma said, seriously cracking eggs into a bowl, with the practiced ease of someone who'd been helping with Sunday breakfast for over a year. "And the batter gets lumpy." Victoria watched intently, asking questions that showed she was taking the lesson seriously. "What if you forget to take the eggs out ahead of time? Is there a way to warm them up quickly?" Emma looked to Blake for guidance on this advanced technique. "Daddy knows a trick for that. Show her, Daddy." Blake demonstrated the warm water bath method for bringing eggs to room temperature. Feeling oddly domestic with Victoria standing so close in their small kitchen, her sleeves rolled up and her hair beginning to curl slightly from the steam rising from the griddle. "That's brilliant," Victoria said, watching him test the egg temperature. "I never would have thought of that." "It's all about problem solving," Blake said. "Cooking is mostly just figuring out how to get the result you want with what you have available." Emma nodded wisely. "Like how Daddy figured out that you can make pancakes fluffier if you separate the eggs and whip the whites, but only if you're very, very careful when you fold them in." Victoria looked between them with something that might have been envy. "You two make a good team." "We learned together," Blake said, beginning to measure flour while Emma supervised. "After Sarah died, neither of us knew how to cook much beyond sandwiches and cereal. We had to figure it out as we went." "Was it hard?" Victoria asked quietly, accepting the measuring cup Emma handed her. "Learning to do everything alone." Blake paused in his mixing, considering how to answer that question honestly without making Victoria uncomfortable. But Emma, with the directness that always caught adults off guard, answered first. "It was really hard at first," she said matter-of-factly, measuring milk with careful precision. "Daddy cried a lot, and I cried a lot, and we ate a lot of frozen dinners that tasted like plastic. But then we figured out that if we did things together, it was more fun and less scary." Victoria's hands stilled on the mixing bowl. "That sounds very wise. Daddy always says that the best way to learn something new is to find someone who already knows how to do it and ask them to teach you. Like how I learned to ride my bike from Jenny's dad, and how Daddy learned to braid hair from watching YouTube videos." Blake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "The YouTube hair tutorials were a dark period in my life." Victoria laughed, and the sound filled their small kitchen with warmth. "I can't even imagine trying to learn to braid hair from a video. Did it work?" Emma twisted around to show Victoria the neat French braid Blake had woven that morning. "He got really good at it. He can do ponytails and braids and even those twisty things that look fancy, but are actually easy once you know the trick." "I'm impressed," Victoria said, and she sounded like she meant it. "That's not an easy skill to master." Blake shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "You learn what you need to learn. Emma needed her hair done for school every day, so I figured it out." Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching Emma demonstrate the proper technique for folding beaten egg whites into pancake batter. "I've spent 15 years mastering corporate strategy and financial analysis," she said finally. "But I don't think I've ever learned anything as important as how to braid a little girl's hair." The first batch of pancakes came off the griddle perfectly golden, and Emma insisted on arranging them on plates with the ceremony of someone presenting a fine dining experience. The real maple syrup Victoria had brought was indeed exceptional, and Blake watched with amusement as Emma explained the proper syrup-to-pancake ratio with scientific precision. "You don't want to drown them," Emma instructed, demonstrating with her fork. "But you want enough so that every bite has some sweetness. It's about balance." Victoria followed Emma's technique, exactly taking a careful bite and closing her eyes in appreciation. "These are incredible. I had no idea pancakes could taste like this." "What kind of pancakes have you had before?" Emma asked. Victoria looked slightly embarrassed. "Mostly the kind that come from hotel room service or corporate breakfast meetings. Very flat, very bland, usually cold by the time they reach the table." Emma's eyes widened in horror. "Cold pancakes? That's terrible. Pancakes have to be hot, so the syrup soaks in right and the butter melts." "I'm beginning to realize I've been missing out on a lot of things," Victoria said, taking another bite. "These are better than anything I've ever eaten at a 5-star restaurant." Emma beamed with pride. "That's because we made them with love. Daddy says that's the secret ingredient in everything good." Blake felt Victoria's eyes on him, but he focused on cutting his pancakes into smaller pieces, suddenly self-conscious about the simple wisdom his daughter dispensed so casually. After breakfast, Emma insisted on showing Victoria her room, which meant a detailed tour of every drawing on her walls, every stuffed animal on her bed, and every book on her shelves. Victoria sat cross-legged on Emma's small rug and listened to elaborate explanations about the personalities of various toys with the same attention she probably gave to corporate presentations. "This is Melissa," Emma said, presenting a well-worn baby doll. "She's very good at sleeping, but she doesn't like loud noises, and this is Captain Whiskers." A tabby cat stuffed animal joined the introduction. "He's brave and he protects all the other animals from monsters under the bed." "Does Captain Whiskers do a good job keeping the monsters away?" Victoria asked seriously. Emma nodded. "Very good. I haven't seen a single monster since he moved in. Although Daddy says monsters aren't real anyway. They're just our imagination making us scared of things we don't understand." Victoria glanced at Blake, who was leaning against the doorframe watching the interaction with growing amazement. "Your daddy sounds very wise." "He is. He knows about lots of things, like how to fix broken toys, and how to make bad dreams go away, and how to know when someone needs a hug even if they don't ask for one." Blake cleared his throat, feeling the conversation getting uncomfortably close to territory he wasn't ready to explore. "Emma, why don't you show Victoria the book Mrs. Patterson gave you about ocean animals?" Emma brightened and dove into her bookshelf, emerging with a thick picture book that she'd obviously spent considerable time studying. As she flipped through the pages, explaining the different types of whales and their migration patterns, Blake noticed Victoria watching his daughter with an expression of something that looked like longing. "Emma," Victoria said, when the ocean animal presentation concluded, "can I ask you something?" Emma nodded seriously. "What's the most important thing your daddy has taught you?" Emma considered this question with the gravity it deserved, her small face scrunched in concentration. "That's easy," she said finally. "That it's okay to be sad sometimes, but you don't have to be sad alone, and that helping people feels better than getting things for yourself." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "Those are very important lessons." Uh-huh. "What's the most important thing your daddy taught you?" The question clearly caught Victoria off guard. Blake saw something flicker across her face, surprise, maybe pain, definitely complicated emotion. "My father died when I was very young," Victoria said carefully. "But my uncle who raised me taught me that the world is divided into people who make things happen and people who let things happen to them. He said the most important thing was to make sure I was always in the first group." Emma frowned, clearly processing this philosophy and finding it lacking. "But what about helping people and being kind and making sure everyone feels included?" Victoria looked at Blake helplessly, as if Emma had just asked her to solve advanced calculus. "My uncle didn't think those things were as important as being successful." Emma's frown deepened. "That sounds lonely." "It was," Victoria said quietly, and Blake heard something in her voice that made his chest tighten. "It is." Emma studied Victoria's face with the intense observation that children brought to puzzles they were trying to solve. Then, with the decisive movement that always preceded her more dramatic gestures, she climbed into Victoria's lap and hugged her tightly. "Well, you don't have to be lonely anymore," Emma announced. "Because we're your family now. Right, Daddy?" Blake met Victoria's eyes over Emma's head, seeing surprise and gratitude, and something deeper that made his pulse quicken. Family was a word Emma used easily, applying it to everyone from Mrs. Chen to the librarians at their branch library to the crossing guard at her school. But this felt different, weighted with implications Blake wasn't sure he was ready to examine. "Right," he heard himself say. If Victoria wants to be part of our family. Victoria's arms tightened around Emma, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I would like that very much. They spent the rest of the morning in Emma's room reading books and playing elaborate games that involved most of Emma's toy collection and required Victoria to voice several different stuffed animals with distinct personalities. Blake watched from the doorway, struck by how natural Victoria looked, sitting on his daughter's bedroom floor, completely absorbed in a conversation about whether unicorns preferred rainbow flowers or regular flowers for breakfast. It was almost noon when Blake's phone rang, the unknown number flashing on the screen like a warning. He almost ignored it. Sunday was sacred time reserved for Emma and pancakes, and the slow rhythm of weekends, but something made him answer. Blake Carter. Mr. Carter, this is David Harrison. I apologize for calling on Sunday, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Blake stepped into the hallway, lowering his voice. What kind of situation? There's been an incident at the Riverside Gardens development. The low-income housing complex Ms. Hale decided not to demolish. Someone leaked the change in plans to the press, and now there are protesters at the construction site. The board is demanding an emergency meeting. Blake glanced back toward Emma's room where he could hear Victoria explaining the finer points of Tea Party etiquette to a collection of stuffed animals. What does that have to do with me? Harrison's pause was loaded with implication. The board is questioning Ms. Hale's judgment, Mr. Carter. They're suggesting that her recent experiences have affected her ability to make sound business decisions. They want to understand what influence you might have had on her thinking. Blake felt something cold settle in his stomach. I haven't had any influence on her business decisions. Haven't you? Because the Victoria Hale who would have demolished that housing complex without a second thought seems to have disappeared about the time you pulled her out of that car wreckage. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Blake was becoming a liability, a complication in Victoria's corporate life that her board wasn't prepared to tolerate. And if Victoria was forced to choose between her company and whatever this growing connection between them represented, Blake knew which choice made sense. I'll talk to her, Blake said quietly. I hope you will, Mr. Carter. Ms. Hale's reputation and the stability of her company depend on making the right choices about her personal associations. After Harrison hung up, Blake stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the sound of Emma's laughter mixing with Victoria's from the bedroom. Through the open doorway, he could see Victoria balanced precariously on Emma's small chair, holding a tiny teacup and nodding seriously as Emma explained the proper way to compliment imaginary cookies. This was what Victoria had found in their small apartment, the simple pleasure of being valued for her kindness rather than her power, the joy of someone being genuinely happy to see her without wanting anything in return, the warmth of belonging to something larger than corporate strategy and quarterly profits. And Blake was about to take it away from her. When he returned to Emma's room, Victoria looked up with a smile that faded when she saw his expression. What's wrong? Emma, with the emotional radar that never failed her, immediately picked up on the shift in atmosphere. Daddy, are you okay? Blake forced a smile for his daughter's sake. I'm fine, sweetheart. But Victoria and I need to have a grown-up conversation. Can you play in the living room for a few minutes? Emma nodded solemnly and began gathering her favorite toys, but Blake could see the worry in her small face. She paused in the doorway, looking between Blake and Victoria with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle she didn't have all the pieces for. Are you going away? She asked Victoria directly. Victoria's face softened. No, sweetheart. We just need to talk about some work things that are very boring for little girls. Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation and skipped off to the living room, but Blake could feel the weight of the conversation ahead pressing down on him like a physical force. Victoria stood slowly, her expression growing more guarded, as she read something in Blake's posture that warned her this wasn't going to be a pleasant discussion. "Your lawyer called," Blake said without preamble. "Apparently your board isn't happy about your decision to keep the Riverside Gardens housing complex standing. They think I've been influencing your business decisions." Victoria's face went very still, the warm, relaxed woman who'd been playing tea party with Emma, disappearing behind the mask of corporate composure Blake had seen in their first meeting. "What exactly did Harrison say?" Blake repeated the conversation, watching Victoria's expression grow colder with each word. By the time he finished, she looked like a different person, remote, calculating, dangerous in the way that only truly powerful people could be. "They want to meet you," she said finally, "to assess what kind of influence you have over my decision-making. And if they decide I'm a bad influence," Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade, "then they'll try to remove you from the equation." Blake felt the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in around him. "How? Any number of ways. Your construction company could lose its city contracts. Your apartment building could be sold to developers who raise the rent beyond what you can afford. Emma's school could suddenly have questions about your fitness as a parent." Victoria's voice was matter-of-fact, but Blake could see the fury burning behind her controlled expression. "When people like my board want you gone, Blake, you tend to disappear." The casual way she described the destruction of his life should have terrified him, but instead Blake felt a strange kind of calm settle over him. This was what he'd been expecting from the beginning, the moment when Victoria's world and his world proved incompatible, when the difference in their power became impossible to ignore. "So, what do you want me to do?" he asked. Victoria studied his face, and Blake could see her weighing options, calculating strategies, planning moves in a game he didn't even understand the rules of. "I want you to let me handle this," she said finally. "I want you to trust me to protect what we've built here." "What have we built, Victoria?" Blake asked quietly. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you found a way to remember what normal life feels like. And I found a way to put my daughter in danger by getting involved with someone whose enemies can destroy us without breaking a sweat." Victoria flinched, as if he'd slapped her. "Is that really what you think this is, some kind of charity project for my benefit?" Blake looked through the doorway toward the living room, where Emma was arranging her stuffed animals in careful rows, preparing for what appeared to be an elaborate performance. His daughter, who believed that teaching someone to have fun was the most important job in the world, who thought that kindness was more valuable than money, who trusted that her daddy could protect her from anything. "I think," Blake said carefully, "that you're a good person who got lost in a world that doesn't reward good people. And I think Emma and I helped you remember who you used to be before you learned that power was the only thing that mattered." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "And now I think you have to choose between being the person you are when you're sitting on my daughter's bedroom floor playing with stuffed animals, or being the person who can protect a billion-dollar company from a board of directors who see kindness as weakness." "What if I don't want to choose?" Blake's heart broke a little at the vulnerability in her voice, but he forced himself to stay focused on the only thing that really mattered. "Then Emma pays the price for your indecision, and I can't let that happen." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring out Emma's bedroom window at the gray Seattle sky. When she spoke, her voice was soft but determined. "What if there was a third option?" "What do you mean?" Victoria turned to face him, and Blake saw something in her expression that he'd never seen before, not the corporate strategist or the vulnerable woman seeking connection, but something else entirely. Something that looked like revolution. What if I told the board exactly where they could put their concerns about my judgment? What if I reminded them that I own 51% of this company and my personal life is none of their business? Blake stared at her. You'd risk your company for this, for us. I'd risk everything, Victoria said simply. Because for the first time in 15 years, I remember what it feels like to be human. And I'm not going back to being a corporate machine just because it makes other people comfortable. From the living room came the sound of Emma's voice explaining something complex about animal behavior to her assembled audience of toys. Blake listened to his daughter's cheerful chatter and felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Your board won't just give up, he said. They'll find other ways to pressure you, other ways to come after us. Victoria's smile was fierce predatory, the expression of someone who'd spent years learning how to fight and win in a world designed to break people like her. Let them try. They seem to have forgotten that I didn't build this company by backing down from fights. Blake studied her face, seeing the steel beneath the softness, the strength that had allowed a 12-year-old orphan to grow up to command billions of dollars and reshape city skylines. This was Victoria Hale at her most dangerous, not the polished CEO or the woman learning to make pancakes, but the survivor who'd clawed her way to the top and intended to stay there. What are you thinking? He asked. Victoria's smile widened. I'm thinking it's time my board learned what happens when they threaten the people I care about. She walked to Emma's window and pulled out her phone, dialing a number from memory. Blake could hear the ringing, then a crisp, professional voice answering. Patricia, it's Victoria. I need you to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. She paused, listening. Yes, I know it's Sunday evening. Yes, I know it's short notice. And Patricia, make sure every single board member understands that attendance is mandatory. I have something important to discuss with them. After she hung up, Victoria turned back to Blake with an expression of grim satisfaction. 15 years ago, my uncle taught me that power was the only thing that mattered in this world. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to teach my board of directors what real power looks like. Emma appeared in the doorway, holding Captain Whiskers and looking between the two adults with concerned eyes. Are you done with your boring grown-up talk? Victoria crouched down to Emma's level, her expression instantly softening. We're done, sweetheart. I'm sorry we had to take time away from our tea party. Emma studied Victoria's face with the careful attention she gave to all important matters. Are you in trouble at work? Victoria glanced at Blake, who nodded his permission to be honest. Some people at my work think I've been making bad choices. They want me to stop being friends with you and your daddy. Emma's face scrunched up in the expression that always preceded her more indignant pronouncements. That's stupid. Being friends with us is a very good choice. We teach you important things like how to make pancakes and how to pick the best apples and how to have fun on Saturday adventures. You're absolutely right, Victoria said seriously. Those are very important things to know. Emma nodded firmly. So what are you going to tell the stupid people at work? Victoria's laugh was pure delight, free from the calculated control that usually characterized her public interactions. I'm going to tell them that Emma Carter is the smartest person I know, and if they don't like my friends, they can find someone else to make all their decisions for them. Emma clapped her hands in approval. Good. And if they're still mean to you, you can bring them here, and Daddy can teach them about being nice to people. Blake felt something warm and complicated expand in his chest as he watched Victoria and Emma together. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever consequences came from Victoria's decision to choose their small family over corporate expectations, this moment was worth it. The sight of his daughter secure in the knowledge that she was valued and protected, the knowledge that Victoria had found something worth fighting for, It was worth whatever battles lay ahead. Actually, Emma said with the sudden brightness that usually preceded her best ideas, I think you should bring them pancakes. Nobody can be mean when they're eating good pancakes. Victoria looked at Blake over Emma's head, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something that looked like joy. You know what, Emma? That might be the best business strategy I've ever heard. The rest of Sunday passed quietly, the three of them settling into the comfortable rhythm that had somehow developed over the course of just a few weeks. They read books, played games, and shared a simple dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Victoria helped Emma with a puzzle, listened to her practice reading, and seemed genuinely engaged with the small domestic rituals that made up their Sunday routine. As evening approached, and it came time for Victoria to leave, Emma insisted on a proper goodbye ceremony that involved hugging everyone, including Splash Victoria Carter and Captain Whiskers, and making Victoria promise to call if she got scared during her big, important meeting. I will, Victoria promised seriously. And if the meeting goes well, maybe we can celebrate with ice cream next weekend. Emma's eyes lit up. The good kind from the market. The very best kind, Victoria confirmed. After Emma was settled in bed with her usual collection of stuffed animals and bedtime stories, Blake walked Victoria to the door. They stood in the hallway for a moment, neither quite ready to end the day, both aware that tomorrow would bring changes neither of them could fully predict. Are you sure about this? Blake asked quietly. About confronting your board. You're risking everything you've built. Victoria looked back toward Emma's room, where soft snoring indicated that a 5-year-old had succumbed to the exhaustion of a day spent teaching important life skills to a billionaire CEO. I built that company to prove that I was strong enough to survive in a world that didn't care about orphaned 12-year-old girls, she said softly. But Emma's taught me something my uncle never did, that real strength isn't about protecting yourself from caring about people. Real strength is about caring so much that you're willing to fight anyone who threatens the people you love. Blake felt his breath catch at her casual use of the word love, but before he could analyze what that meant, Victoria was continuing. Besides, she said, with a smile that was equal parts warmth and steel, I've spent 15 years learning how to win fights in boardrooms. Tomorrow I get to find out if I'm as good at it as I think I am. Blake was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the dim hallway light. What can I do to help? Victoria's expression softened completely. Just keep being exactly who you are. Keep raising Emma to believe that kindness matters more than power. That helping people is more important than helping yourself. And that pancakes made with love really do taste better than anything money can buy. She kissed his cheek softly, a gesture so natural and unguarded that it took Blake's breath away. Thank you, she whispered, for saving my life in ways I didn't even know I needed saving. After Victoria left, Blake stood in his quiet apartment, listening to the familiar sounds of Sunday evening. Emma's soft breathing from her room, the neighbor's television, through the thin walls, the distant hum of traffic from the street below. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but somehow the world felt fundamentally different. Tomorrow, Victoria would walk into a boardroom and choose between the life she'd built and the life she'd discovered. Tomorrow, Blake would find out whether love was stronger than corporate pressure, whether integrity could stand up to calculated cruelty, whether a single father and his 5-year-old daughter really could change the heart of someone who'd forgotten she had one. But tonight, he was going to check on Emma one more time, maybe read another chapter of the book they'd been working through together, and fall asleep to the sound of rain on the windows and the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing really was enough. Monday morning came gray and drizzly, But by Tuesday, the Seattle newspapers were full of a very different kind of story. Hale Industries Board shake-up CEO retains control after dramatic confrontation, read the headline in the Seattle Times. The article went on to describe how Victoria Hale had walked into an emergency board meeting and systematically dismantled every argument against her recent change in priorities, using a combination of financial projections, market analysis, and what one anonymous source described as the most terrifying display of corporate dominance I've ever witnessed. But Blake learned the real story that Saturday morning at the farmers market, where Victoria appeared at their usual meeting spot, with a smile that could have lit up the gray Seattle sky and Emma's favorite kind of apple turnovers from the bakery sisters. "I told them," she said simply, as Emma ran ahead to greet Harold Peterson, "that anyone who had a problem with my friendship with the man who saved my life was welcome to find another company to work for." 3 of them resigned on the spot. Blake stared at her. "And the others?" Victoria's grin was pure triumph. The others realized that maybe they'd underestimated exactly what kind of person they'd been trying to manipulate. Turns out, when you've spent your whole life learning how to survive, you get very good at recognizing threats, and even better at neutralizing them. As they watched Emma explain proper apple selection technique to a patient, Harold Peterson, Blake felt something settle into place in his chest that he'd been afraid to name for weeks. This was his life now, Saturday mornings, at the farmer's market, with a woman who'd chosen love over power, who'd risked everything for the chance to belong to something real. "So what happens now?" he asked. Victoria took his hand, her fingers warm and sure in his. "Now we teach Emma how to make apple turnovers. And next Saturday we have another adventure. And the Saturday after that, and the Saturday after that, for as long as you'll have me." Emma came bounding back with a bag of apples and news about a new vendor who was selling honey made from lavender farms. As she chattered about her latest discoveries, Blake watched Victoria listen with the complete attention she'd learned to bring to everything Emma said, and realized that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world really was simply having someone care enough to pull you from the wreckage. 3 months later, Emma Carter stood in the playground at Lincoln Elementary, explaining to her kindergarten class why her family was bigger now, but not different in any of the ways that mattered. "Victoria's not my stepmom," she said, with the authority of someone who'd given this considerable thought. "She's my family mom. That means she chose to love us even though she didn't have to, which makes it extra special." And if any of the other children noticed that Emma's family mom drove a car that cost more than their parents made in a year, or that she sometimes appeared in the business section of their parents' newspapers, they were too busy learning about proper pancake technique and the importance of kindness to care very much about things that didn't really matter anyway. Because sometimes when 2 broken people find each other at exactly the right moment, they don't just heal themselves, they build something stronger than either could have managed alone. Sometimes strength isn't about the power to control or manipulate or intimidate. Sometimes strength is about the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to accept help when it's offered, and the faith to believe that love really can triumph over fear. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single father's decision to run toward danger instead of away from it changes not just 2 lives, but 3, and creates a family held together, not by obligation or convenience, but by the simple recognition that everyone deserves to belong somewhere, to be valued for who they are, rather than what they can provide, and to wake up each morning knowing that someone will be genuinely happy to see them. In the end, Victoria Hale learned that the most important business she could ever conduct was the business of building a life worth living. Blake Carter learned that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the greatest rewards, And Emma Carter learned that families come in all different shapes and sizes, but the best ones are built on foundation stones of pancakes made with love, Saturday adventures, shared with people who care, and the unshakable belief that kindness really is the most powerful force in the world. The steel beam that had crashed down that rainy Tuesday afternoon had been meant to destroy. Instead, it had created something beautiful, a collision of two worlds that shouldn't have intersected but did, and in doing so proved that sometimes the most unlikely rescues save not just one life but all the lives that life touches. And every Sunday morning, in a small apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, three people who had found each other against all odds gathered around a kitchen table to make pancakes, plan adventures, and build the kind of love that could withstand any storm, corporate or otherwise.